He himself remembered everything, because these were the last memories of that woman. He was seeing her for the last time, though he did not know it then. Monsieur de Castel returned, breaking into that atmosphere of enchantment Tomasov had been drinking in, even to complete unconsciousness of the external world. Tomasov could not help being struck by the distinction of his movements, the ease of his manner, his superiority to all the other men he knew, and he suffered from it. It occurred to him that these two brilliant beings on the sofa were made for each other. De Castel, sitting down by the side of the lady, murmured to her discreetly, "There is not the slightest doubt that it's true." And they both turned their eyes to Tomasov. Roused thoroughly from his enchantment, he became self-conscious. A feeling of shyness came over him. He sat smiling faintly at them. The lady, without taking her eyes off the blushing Tomasov, said with a dreamy gravity quite unusual to her, "I should like to know that your generosity can be supreme, without a flaw. Love at its highest should be the origin of every perfection." Tomasov opened his eyes wide with admiration at this, as though her lips had been dropping real pearls. The sentiment, however, was not uttered for the primitive Russian youth, but for the exquisitely accomplished man of the world, de Castel. Tomasov could not see the effect it produced, because the French officer lowered his head and sat there contemplating his admirably polished boots. The lady whispered in a sympathetic tone, "You have scruples?" De Castel, without looking up, murmured, "It could be turned into a nice point of honor." She said vivaciously, "That surely is artificial. I am for all natural feeling. I believe in nothing else. But perhaps your conscience—" He interrupted her. "Not at all. My conscience is not childish. The fate of those people is of no military importance to us. What can it matter? The fortune of France is invincible." "Well, then," she uttered meaningly, and rose from the couch. The French officer stood up too. Tomasov hastened to follow their example. He was pained by his state of utter mental darkness. While he was raising the lady's white hand to his lips, he heard the French officer say with marked emphasis, "If he has the soul of a warrior," at that time, you know, people really talked in that way, "if he has the soul of a warrior, he ought to fall at your feet in gratitude." Tomasov felt himself plunged into even denser darkness than before. He followed the French officer out of the room and out of the house, for he had a notion that this was expected of him. It was getting dusk. The weather was very bad, and the street was quite deserted. The Frenchman lingered in it strangely, and Tomasov lingered too, without impatience. He was never in a hurry to get away from the house in which she lived. And besides, something wonderful had happened to him. The hand he had reverently raised by the tips of its fingers had been pressed against his lips. He had received a secret favor. He was almost frightened. The world had reeled, and it had hardly steadied itself yet. De Castel stopped short at the corner of the quiet street. "I don't care to be seen too much with you in the lighted thoroughfares, Monsieur Tomasov," he said in a strangely grim tone. "Why?" asked the young man, too startled to be offended. "From prudence," answered the other curtly. "So we will have to part here. But before we part, I'll disclose to you something of which you will see at once the importance." This, please note, was an evening in late March of the year 1812. For a long time already there had been talk of a growing coolness between Russia and France. The word war was being whispered in drawing rooms louder and louder, and at last was heard in official circles. Thereupon, the Parisian police discovered that our military envoy had corrupted some clerks at the Ministry of War and had obtained from them some very important confidential documents. The wretched men, there were 2 of them, had confessed their crime and were to be shot that night. Tomorrow all the town would be talking of the affair. But the worst was, the Emperor Napoleon was furiously angry at the discovery, and had made up his mind to have the Russian envoy arrested. Such was de Castel's disclosure, and though he had spoken in low tones, Tomasov was stunned as by a great crash. "Arrested?" he murmured desolately. "Yes, and kept as a state prisoner, with everybody belonging to him." The French officer seized Tomasov's arm above the elbow and pressed it hard. "And kept in France," he repeated into Tomasov's very ear, and then letting him go, stepped back a space and remained silent. "And it's you who are telling me this?" cried Tomasov in an extremity of gratitude that was hardly greater than his admiration for the generosity of his future foe. Could a brother have done for him more? He sought to seize the hand of the French officer, but the latter remained wrapped up closely in his cloak. Possibly in the dark he had not noticed the attempt. He moved back a bit, and in his self-possessed voice of a man of the world, as though he were speaking across a card table or something of the sort, he called Tomasov's attention to the fact that if he meant to make use of the warning, the moments were precious. "Indeed they are," agreed the awed Tomasov. "Goodbye, then. I have no word of thanks to equal your generosity. But if ever I have an opportunity, I swear it, you may command my life." But the Frenchman retreated, had already vanished in the dark, lonely street. Tomasov was alone, and then he did not waste any of the precious minutes of that night. See how people's mere gossip and idle talk pass into history. In all the memoirs of the time, if you read them, you will find it stated that our envoy had a warning from some highly placed woman who was in love with him. Of course, it's known that he had successes with women, and in the highest spheres, too. But the truth is that the person who warned him was no other than our simple Tomasov, an altogether different sort of lover from himself. This, then, is the secret of our Emperor's representative's escape from arrest. He and all his official household got out of France all right, as history records. And amongst that household there was our Tomasov, of course. He had, in the words of the French officer, the soul of a warrior. And what more desolate prospect for a man with such a soul than to be imprisoned on the eve of war, to be cut off from his country in danger, from his military family, from his duty, from honor, and, well, from glory, too. Tomasov used to shudder at the mere thought of the moral torture he had escaped, and he nursed in his heart a boundless gratitude to the 2 people who had saved him from that cruel ordeal. They were wonderful. For him, love and friendship were but 2 aspects of exalted perfection. He had found these fine examples of it, and he vowed them indeed a sort of cult. It affected his attitude towards Frenchmen in general, great patriot as he was. He was naturally indignant at the invasion of his country, but this indignation had no personal animosity in it. He was fundamentally a fine nature. He grieved at the appalling amount of human suffering he saw around him. Yes, he was full of compassion for all forms of mankind's misery in a manly way. Less fine figures than his own did not understand this very well. In the regiment they had nicknamed him the humane Tomasov. He didn't take offense at it. There is nothing incompatible between humanity and a warrior's soul. People without compassion are the civilians, government officials, merchants, and such like. As to the ferocious talk one hears from a lot of decent people in wartime, well, the tongue is an unruly member at best, and when there is some excitement going on, there is no curbing its furious activity. So I had not been very surprised to see our Tomasov sheathe deliberately his sword, right in the middle of that charge, you may say. As we rode away after it, he was very silent. He was not a chatterer, as a rule, but it was evident that this close view of the Grand Army had affected him deeply, like some sight not of this earth. I had always been a pretty tough individual myself, well, even I, and there was that fellow with a lot of poetry in his nature. You may imagine what he made of it to himself. We rode side by side without opening our lips. It was simply beyond words. We established our bivouac along the edge of the forest so as to get some shelter for our horses. However, the boisterous north wind had dropped as quickly as it had sprung up, and the great winter stillness lay on the land from the Baltic to the Black Sea. One could almost feel its cold, lifeless immensity reaching up to the stars. Our men had lighted several fires for their officers and had cleared the snow around them. We had big logs of wood for seats. It was a very tolerable bivouac upon the whole, even without the exultation of victory. We were to feel that later, but at present we were oppressed by our stern and arduous task. There were 3 of us round my fire. The third one was that adjutant. He was, perhaps, a well-meaning chap, but not so nice as he might have been had he been less rough in manner and less crude in his perceptions. He would reason about people's conduct as though a man were as simple a figure as, say, 2 sticks laid across each other, whereas a man is much more like the sea, whose movements are too complicated to explain, and whose depths may bring up God only knows what at any moment. We talked a little about that charge, not much. That sort of thing does not lend itself to conversation. Tomasov muttered a few words about a mere butchery. I had nothing to say. As I told you, I had very soon let my sword hang idle at my waist. That starving mob had not even tried to defend itself. Just a few shots. We had 2 men wounded. 2! And we had charged the main column of Napoleon's Grand Army. Tomasov muttered wearily, "What was the good of it?" I did not wish to argue, so I only just mumbled, "Ah, well." But the adjutant struck in unpleasantly, "Why, it warmed the men a bit. It has made me warm. That's a good enough reason. But our Tomasov is so humane. And besides, he has been in love with a Frenchwoman, and thick as thieves with a lot of Frenchmen, so he is sorry for them. Never mind, my boy. We are on the Paris road now, and you shall soon see her." This was one of his usual, as we believed them, foolish speeches. None of us but believed that the getting to Paris would be a matter of years. Of years. And lo, less than 18 months afterwards, I was rooked of a lot of money in a gambling hell in the Palais Royal. Truth being often the most senseless thing in the world, is sometimes revealed to fools. I don't think that adjutant of ours believed in his own words. He just wanted to tease Tomasov from habit, purely from habit. We, of course, said nothing, and so he took his head in his hands and fell into a doze as he sat on a log in front of the fire. Our cavalry was on the extreme right wing of the army, and I must confess that we guarded it very badly. We had lost all sense of insecurity by this time, but still we did keep up a pretense of doing it in a way. Presently a trooper rode up, leading a horse, and Tomasov mounted stiffly and went off on a round of the outposts, of the perfectly useless outposts. The night was still, except for the crackling of the fires. The raging wind had lifted far above the earth, and not the faintest breath of it could be heard. Only the full moon swam out with a rush into the sky and suddenly hung high and motionless overhead. I remember raising my hairy face to it for a moment. Then I verily believe I dozed off too, bent double on my log, with my head towards the fierce blaze. You know what an impermanent thing such slumber is. One moment you drop into an abyss, and the next you are back in the world that you would think too deep for any noise but the trumpet of the last judgment. And then off you go again. Your very soul seems to slip down into a bottomless black pit, then up once more into a startled consciousness. A mere plaything of cruel sleep one is, then, tormented both ways. However, when my orderly appeared before me, repeating, "Won't your honor be pleased to eat? Won't your honor be pleased to eat?" I managed to keep my hold of it, I mean that gaping consciousness. He was offering me a sooty pot containing some grain boiled in water with a pinch of salt. A wooden spoon was stuck in it. At that time, these were the only rations we were getting regularly. Mere chicken food, confound it. But the Russian soldier is wonderful. Well, my fellow waited till I had feasted and then went away, carrying off the empty pot. I was no longer sleepy. Indeed, I had become awake with an exaggerated mental consciousness of existence extending beyond any immediate surroundings. Those are but exceptional moments with mankind, I am glad to say. I had the intimate sensation of the earth in all its enormous expanse, wrapped in snow, with nothing showing on it but trees with their straight stalk-like trunks and their funereal verdure, and in this aspect of general mourning I seemed to hear the sighs of mankind falling to die in the midst of a nature without life. They were Frenchmen. We didn't hate them. They did not hate us. We had existed far apart, and suddenly they had come rolling in with arms in their hands, without fear of God, carrying with them other nations, and all to perish together in a long, long trail of frozen corpses. I had an actual vision of that trail, a pathetic multitude of small dark mounds stretching away under the moonlight in a clear, still, and pitiless atmosphere, a sort of horrible peace. But what other peace could there be for them? What else did they deserve? I don't know by what connection of emotions there came into my head the thought that the earth was a pagan planet, and not a fit abode for Christian virtues. You may be surprised that I should remember all this so well. What is a passing emotion or half-formed thought to last so many years of a man's changing, inconsequential life? But what has fixed the emotion of that evening in my recollection, so that the slightest shadows remain indelible, was an event of strange finality, an event not likely to be forgotten in a lifetime, as you shall see. I don't suppose I had been entertaining those thoughts more than 5 minutes when something induced me to look over my shoulder. I can't think it was a noise. The snow deadened all the sounds. Something it must have been, some sort of signal reaching my consciousness. Anyway, I turned my head, and there was the event approaching me. Not that I knew it or had the slightest premonition. All I saw in the distance were 2 figures approaching in the moonlight. One of them was our Tomasov. The dark mass behind him which moved across my sight were the horses which his orderly was leading away. Tomasov was a very familiar appearance, in long boots, a tall figure ending in a pointed hood. But by his side advanced another figure. I mistrusted my eyes at first. It was amazing. It had a shining crested helmet on its head, and was muffled up in a white cloak. The cloak was not as white as snow, nothing in the world is. It was white more like mist, with an aspect that was ghostly and martial to an extraordinary degree. It was as if Tomasov had got hold of the god of war himself. I could see at once that he was leading this resplendent vision by the arm. Then I saw that he was holding it up. While I stared and stared, they crept on, for indeed they were creeping, and at last they crept into the light of our bivouac fire and passed beyond the log I was sitting on. The blaze played on the helmet. It was extremely battered, and the frost-bitten face, full of sores under it, was framed in bits of mangy fur. No god of war this, but a French officer. The great white cuirassier's cloak was torn, burnt full of holes. His feet were wrapped up in old sheepskins over remnants of boots. They looked monstrous, and he tottered on them, sustained by Tomasov, who lowered him most carefully onto the log on which I sat. My amazement knew no bounds. "You have brought in a prisoner," I said to Tomasov, as if I could not believe my eyes. "You must understand that unless they surrendered in large bodies, we made no prisoners. What would have been the good? Our Cossacks either killed the stragglers or else let them alone, just as it happened. It came really to the same thing in the end." Tomasov turned to me with a very troubled look. "He sprang up from the ground somewhere as I was leaving the outpost," he said. "I believe he was making for it, for he walked blindly into my horse. He got hold of my leg, and of course none of our chaps dared touch him then." "He had a narrow escape," I said. "He didn't appreciate it," said Tomasov, looking even more troubled than before. "He came along, holding to my stirrup leather. That's what made me so late. He told me he was a staff officer, and then, talking in a voice such I supposed as the damned alone use, a croaking of rage and pain, he said he had a favor to beg of me, a supreme favor. Did I understand him, he asked in a sort of fiendish whisper. Of course I told him that I did. I said, "Oui, je vous comprends." Then he said, "Do it. Now, at once, in the pity of your heart." Tomasov ceased and stared queerly at me above the head of the prisoner. I said, "What did he mean?" "That's what I asked him," answered Tomasov in a dazed tone. "And he said that he wanted me to do him the favor to blow his brains out. As a fellow soldier," he said, "as a man of feeling, as a humane man." The prisoner sat between us like an awful gashed mummy as to the face, a martial scarecrow, a grotesque horror of rags and dirt with awful living eyes, full of vitality, full of unquenchable fire, in a body of horrible affliction, a skeleton at the feast of glory. And suddenly those shining, unextinguishable eyes of his became fixed upon Tomasov. He, poor fellow, fascinated, returned the ghastly stare of a suffering soul in that mere husk of a man. The prisoner croaked at him in French. "I recognize you, no? You are a Russian youngster. You were very grateful. I call on you to pay the debt. Pay it, I say, with one liberating shot. You are a man of honor. I have not even a broken saber. All my being recoils from my own degradation. You know me." Tomasov said nothing. "Haven't you got the soul of a warrior?" the Frenchman asked in an angry whisper, but with something of a mocking intention in it. "I don't know," said poor Tomasov. What a look of contempt that scarecrow gave him out of his unquenchable eyes. He seemed to live only by the force of infuriated and impotent despair. Suddenly he gave a gasp and fell forward, writhing in the agony of cramp in all his limbs, a not unusual effect of the heat of a campfire. It resembled the application of some horrible torture, but he tried to fight against the pain at first. He only moaned low while we bent over him so as to prevent him rolling into the fire, and muttered feverishly at intervals, "Tuez-moi, tuez-moi," till, vanquished by the pain, he screamed in agony, time after time, each cry bursting out through his compressed lips. The adjutant woke up on the other side of the fire and started swearing awfully at the beastly row that Frenchman was making. "What's this? More of your infernal humanity, Tomasov?" he yelled at us. "Why don't you have him thrown out of this to the devil on the snow?" As we paid no attention to his shouts, he got up, cursing shockingly, and went away to another fire. Presently the French officer became easier. We propped him up against the log and sat silent on each side of him till the bugles started their call at the first break of day. The big flame, kept up all through the night, paled on the livid sheet of snow, while the frozen air all round rang with the brazen notes of cavalry trumpets. The Frenchman's eyes, fixed in a glassy stare, which for a moment made us hope that he had died quietly, sitting there between us two, stirred slowly to right and left, looking at each of our faces in turn. Tomasov and I exchanged glances of dismay. Then de Castel's voice, unexpected in its renewed strength and ghastly self-possession, made us shudder inwardly. "Bonjour, monsieur." His chin dropped on his breast. Tomasov addressed me in Russian. "It is he, the man himself." I nodded, and Tomasov went on in a tone of anguish. "Yes, he, brilliant, accomplished, envied by men, loved by that woman. This horror, this miserable thing that cannot die. Look at his eyes. It's terrible." I did not look, but I understood what Tomasov meant. We could do nothing for him. The avenging winter of fate held both the fugitives and the pursuers in its iron grip. Compassion was but a vain word before that unrelenting destiny. I tried to say something about a convoy being no doubt collected in the village, but I faltered at the mute glance Tomasov gave me. We knew what those convoys were like. Appalling mobs of hopeless wretches driven on by the butts of Cossacks' lances back to the frozen inferno, with their faces set away from their homes. Our two squadrons had been formed along the edge of the forest. The minutes of anguish were passing. The Frenchman suddenly struggled to his feet. We helped him almost without knowing what we were doing. "Come," he said in measured tones. "This is the moment." He paused for a long time, then with the same distinctness went on. "On my word of honor, all faith is dead in me." His voice lost suddenly its self-possession. After waiting a little, while he added in a murmur, "And even my courage, upon my honor." Another long pause ensued before, with a great effort, he whispered hoarsely, "Isn't this enough to move a heart of stone? Am I to go on my knees to you?"